Good afternoon, racers. I thought we'd take a few more minutes and talk about some other designs from the history of Formula E. Part of Formula E is really making sure that we learn from past designs, and we're not trying to simply figure out the best one of those, but we want to figure out the theories behind each one of these and then figure out how we make one that's better. So last time we talked about this design, which is a three-wheel layout, and the idea is to make things really, really lightweight. It has a torque tube design that drives one wheel in the back, front wheels for steering. And by contrast, today I thought we'd talk about, this was from I think the year 2011, and I think this one was about 2 years later. This was also the championship car for that year. The team that made this started by doing some research, and what they observed was, you know, it's interesting. We can learn a lot from looking at other racing vehicles, and very few of them have three wheels. They almost always have four wheels for a really good reason. Four wheels will allow a very stable vehicle. It means it has no place it'll fall over. When it takes turns, it has 4 points of contact, so it has very good traction. And when we take a turn, this works very well to stay stable, because as the energy goes to the outside, it doesn't want to flip over. It stays stable on all four wheels. So it's interesting that most race cars have four wheels. And in doing their research, they studied some of the racing vehicles, I think in particular the Can-Am racing, which was really big years ago. And they took one of the famous cars and they measured the dimension between the wheels. And though this is smaller scale, it's the same proportions. So they're starting with a proportion that's already been proven on the racetrack. And if you take a look, there's something that's interesting here, is that the rear wheels are a little bit narrower than the front wheels. So we would say the front track is measured from the center of the wheel to the center of the wheel, and the rear track, center of the wheel to the center of the wheel. The bottom is a little narrower, and the top is a little bit wider. And what that does is, when this car has the energy driving from the back, as it pushes forward, it's always pushing between these two wheels, and that helps keep the vehicle going straight. Okay? Keeps it so it tracks really straight forward. We find when you have a wider track in the back than in the front, sometimes they have handling problems. They don't steer so reliably. Now, this car, I think this was the year kind of everything really became carbon fiber. There are a few pieces. This one has the steering components are a combination of things that they purchased from existing radio-controlled cars. These tires are from existing 1/10 scale radio-controlled cars. And then they made their own rapid prototype pieces. These are made by FDM process, so they're made out of ABS plastic. And when our students work on these parts that they're using rapid prototyping materials, those materials are really not made to be used in this functional manner. They're used to be representative of some final part. So they have to do some really clever things to make sure that the part builds in the right direction so it will be strong enough. Other than that, this one is made out of sheets of carbon fiber that have been cut with a CNC machine. They worked with a vendor to produce that. And so it gives them a very structurally strong frame. The position of the wheels front to back don't move at all. This is it's like a bridge this way, right? But there's still, importantly, there's a little bit of flex this way. And that's kind of important with this layout, because if this hits a bump in the back, it's important that it doesn't lose traction. So a little bit of flexibility turns out to be an important part of this design layout. They're using one servo up front. It's kind of, they had a tidy way of packaging it here so we don't see many of the wires. That just makes it easy. There's a nice switch right here that makes it easy to turn on and off. That's really handy when you're racing to not have to handle batteries and things. And then this is the braking mechanism. And the brake on this one is really what we would call a clutch. So the way that the design works on this, and this was a real change in the approach. When this vehicle was made, the 16 feet of rubber band were made into a 1 foot, 12-inch loop, which means that there were 16 strands total of rubber band. This time, when they were doing this, now they're making a much shorter 6-inch rubber band, which doubles the number of strands, and it makes a much higher torque. So in order to pull this rubber band in, it takes a lot of force. It's really got a lot of power. And what that means is it will create a lot more torque and force when you wind it up. But it also means it doesn't have as many turns. So this one can go a long distance because it has many turns on the skinnier rubber band. This one has a lot of power, but not so many turns. So now, instead of braking, the idea is to have this servo, it drops a little pin down here, and then it stops this. All right, so this clamp becomes something that stops. It just kind of sticks a finger in there, and it keeps it from rotating. And at that point, then, these wheels can continue to spin freely, and with the friction that's on the wheels, the car will slow down. But it allows the drivers to save the rubber band winds so they can cover a long distance, and it also gives them a lot of power so they can go quickly. We'll take a look here too. These wheels have been designed so that knowing how many turns they're going to get out of the rubber band, they know this size wheel will allow them to go around the longest track and make it without running out of power. So that's the way the size of this is figured out. Otherwise, this is what we call a direct drive torque tube. So the rubber band is turning this whole tube, and as long as it's turning in this direction, it turns both the wheels. But when the wheels need to, when we're taking a turn, this wheel doesn't turn as many times as this one needs to, because this one's traveling further. And so it's important that these aren't connected completely. So on the case of these designs, they slip in one direction and they grab in another. And this uses a mechanism called a clutch bearing or a one-way bearing. Now, these guys were really successful. This was a really great team. They worked well together, and they made many versions of this to finally get to this design. In fact, when they got to the final race, they actually had made 2 of them. They had a complete spare car that they made. They worked with different vendors to get this frame made, and they actually found out when they talked to the vendors that when they learned that they were students and they were trying to make something happen, they were able to get these parts made for a very low price because the people at the company that made those components were interested in helping them. So here's I want to show you this. In order to get to this design, it would be very expensive to do all the experiments with this carbon fiber. So the way that they did most of the development of their design was with very thin plywood, not very expensive. And this can use the laser cutter, which we have close by upstairs in our shop. And so they were able to build many of these wood designs. This is another one of the carbon fiber chassis. And if you hold them up, you can see this is actually just about as light and strong as this is. Not quite as strong. So In Formula E, sometimes we go off the track, we hit things. The wood isn't as good at surviving that kind of an impact, but it also is really easy to quickly make another part, and it's not very expensive. So we find that using this laser cutter with plywood is a good way to represent something like the carbon fiber material. And so you can test out lots of ideas and prove out that your design works before you spend the money and take the time. This is harder to fabricate. You have to do some experimentation to figure out what kind of glues will work. Whereas the wood, this is like making furniture. So it's a lot easier to figure this out. Okay, so that's our session for today. We've got a 4-wheel platform, very, very low center of gravity. It's interesting to see when you're doing Formula E here in Pasadena, the tallest bump that you need to drive over is about as high as this pen. And that means that if the car's coming up like this, it needs to be able to get over this. And the bigger problem is you don't want this part to hit, because that's the part that's gonna catch. So these guys made it as low as they possibly could, and that means that the center of gravity for the vehicle is very low. That means it's going to be really good at taking turns. It also means that most of the airflow goes over the top, which reduces the amount of drag on the design, and that means it goes through the air pretty well. So this was the champion car just a couple of years ago, and this design is one of the design basic layouts that a lot of people are still using now if they're going to be top competitors. That's all today, race fans. See you next time.